$50,000 sitting in a savings account, earning 5%, completely safe, completely insured, growing every single month while you sleep. On paper, that is what a person looks like when they have finally figured money out. That was me for about a year and a half. Then one afternoon, I stopped staring at the headline number and actually did the math underneath it, after taxes, after inflation, after watching the rate quietly fall 3 separate times. And what I found did not make me feel smart. It made me feel like someone had handed me half of a story and let me assume the rest. So today, I want to give you the whole thing, not the version on the bank homepage, the version with the footnotes read out loud, because almost nobody explains this before you park a serious amount of money in one of these accounts. And the gap between what you think you are earning and what you actually keep is wider than it looks. One disclaimer first. I am not a financial advisor. I am a cartoon who looks like the boss daughter and got this job mostly because her father owns the building. So treat everything here as education, not instructions. The decisions stay yours. The math is just here to make them clearer. Let me take you back to when this started, because the timing matters. For most of the last decade, saving money paid you almost nothing. Then, starting in early 2022, the Federal Reserve began raising its benchmark rate faster than it had in a generation. By late 2023, online savings accounts were advertising something that sounded almost fake to anyone who remembered the near zero years. 4%, 4.5%, some as high as 5%. To understand why that felt revolutionary, you have to compare it to where most people money actually lived. A traditional bank, the kind with branches and free pens, was paying about 0.01%. On $10,000, that is $1 of interest in a year. 1. At 5%, that same $10,000 earned $500. Same money, same risk, same 12 months. $1 against $500. So people moved by the millions. They opened accounts at online banks they had never heard of before. Names like SoFi and Ally and Marcus and Wealthfront. And for the first time in years, their emergency funds and their down payment savings were actually earning something real. For a while, it genuinely felt like a quiet revolution, like someone had finally made saving money worth doing again. And here is something I want to be honest about, because skipping it would be dishonest. $50,000 at 5% earns $2,500 in a year. You can picture that. Money that showed up with no spreadsheets, no market swings, no anxiety about earnings calls, just a balance that ticked up every single month. That comfort is real, and it is powerful. Cash that earns something genuinely beats cash that earns nothing. Full stop. But that $2,500 figure is exactly where most people stop reading. They take the advertised rate, multiply it by their balance, and call it finished. That is the gross number. It is the number before the parts that the cheerful product pages tend to bury near the bottom of the page. Start with taxes, because the government does not care that your money sat still. Interest from a savings account is taxed as ordinary income, not the lower rate that long-term investments get. Not some special savings rate, the same rate as your paycheck, the same rate as the freelance income you reported. Still with me? Good, because the next number quietly shrinks everything you just got excited about. Stay right there. So back to it. If you are in the 22% federal bracket, which covers a large slice of working adults, you owe 22 cents on every dollar of interest. 24% bracket, 24 cents. And depending on which state you live in, you may owe state income tax on that interest on top of the federal bite. So run it for real. $50,000 at 5%, $2,500 in gross interest. Apply a combined federal and state rate of around 25% for a typical middle-class earner. And you are keeping about $1,875, not $2,500, not even $2,000. The headline was never the number you actually take home. And that difference is a check you write to the government simply for holding cash. Then there is the quieter force, the one that never sends a statement: inflation. Through 2023 and into 2024, prices in the United States rose between 3 and 4% a year. That matters because your balance can keep growing while the buying power of that balance barely moves at all. Picture it simply. Your $50,000 earns 5%, so the balance climbs to $52,500. But if prices rose 3% that same year, what cost $50,000 at the start of the year now costs about $51,500. So the $2,500 you earned is really closer to $1,000 in actual purchasing power. Then you subtract the taxes you just saw, and the real gain shrinks again. Put it all together, and the math is sobering. If your account pays 5% and inflation runs near 3%, your real return before taxes is only about 2.3%. Apply the tax on the interest, and a middle-class saver is capturing somewhere around 1.5% to 1.8% in genuine, inflation-adjusted, after-tax gains per year. That is still positive. It still beats a traditional account earning nothing, but it is nowhere near the 5% story people are telling themselves at the kitchen table. Now we get to the part that is genuinely uncomfortable, because while that $50,000 sat earning a real return somewhere between 1% and 2%, the stock market was doing something completely different. Across its full history, the S&P 500 has returned about 10% a year on average. Not every year, and not smoothly. Some years it falls hard. But over long stretches, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, that average has stayed remarkably steady, and in 2023 alone, it returned more than 26%. So look at the same single year two different ways. $50,000 in a savings account grew to about $52,500. $50,000 in a broad, low-cost index fund would have grown to roughly $63,000. That is a $10,500 difference in one calendar year between two choices that both felt responsible at the time. Analysts call this opportunity cost, and it is the most expensive invisible fee in personal finance. It never shows up on a statement. No bank mails you a notice saying you missed $10,000 in potential gains. The account just keeps quietly earning its 4 or 5%, while the distance between where your money is and where it could have been grows silently every single month. Stretch the timeline out, and it gets even harder to look at. Take $20,000, not $50,000, just $20,000. Leave it in a savings account for 30 years at 4%. It grows to about $64,800. Take that same $20,000, invest it in a diversified index fund earning the historical 10% average, and after 30 years, it grows to roughly $348,000. Same money, same 30 years, a gap of nearly $284,000 built entirely on the difference between the place that felt safe and the place that felt uncertain. That number is supposed to sit heavy. It is supposed to make you think about the cash sitting in your own accounts right now. The emergency fund that grew way past 6 months of expenses. The down payment money you have been holding for 3 years while you wait for the right house. The cash you keep because the market makes you nervous, and at least this feels solid and real. But before you panic and start moving everything into index funds, stop, because overcorrecting is just as expensive as the original mistake, and that is not the lesson this taught me. The savings account was never the wrong tool. I had it in the wrong role. Almost nobody draws this line clearly enough. A great savings account earning 4 or 5% is built to protect money you might need soon. Emergency money, a purchase you are making within the next year or two. Cash that simply cannot afford to drop 30% in a market dip the week before you need to use it. It is liquid. You can move it to checking in a day or two. It is insured by the FDIC, up to $250,000 per depositor per bank. For the specific job of holding near-term, accessible cash, nothing else does that job better right now. So the problem is not the account. The problem is scope creep. It is how a tool built for one narrow job quietly inherits a much bigger and more important job it was never designed to handle. Most people holding large balances do not actually need all of that money within the next 60 days. They hold it because the account feels safe, the number looks impressive on the screen, and investing feels like handing your money to a slot machine. But that gap between savings money and investing money is not really a financial distinction. It is an emotional one, and it quietly costs more than almost any other money decision a middle-class household makes over a lifetime. Think about how this plays out in a normal household. You work, you save, you accumulate. Some of that is genuinely your emergency fund. 3 to 6 months of real living expenses, immediately accessible because life is unpredictable. That money belongs in a savings account, no question. But beyond that foundation, most people are holding money they will not realistically touch for 5, 10, even 20 years. And when that long-term money parks itself in a savings account, even a good one, the person holding it is quietly choosing a 1.5% real return over a 10% historical one, year after year, without ever sitting down and consciously making that choice. Nobody chooses to leave $284,000 on the table, but millions of people do it anyway, one comfortable savings balance at a time. If this is making you rethink where your money sits, subscribe. Consider it a small deposit into the version of you that actually gets to retire. Now, the timing problem. When the Federal Reserve started cutting rates in late 2024, this whole picture got more urgent. The cuts were gradual, 25 basis points at a time. But the effect on savings yields was fast and one-directional. Accounts paying 5% dropped to 4.5%, then to 4%, then lower. By early 2026, the best rates from competitive online banks had settled around 4%, still strong by historical standards, but well below the peak that made these accounts feel so compelling just a year or two earlier. And here is the part that should change how you see these accounts permanently. An index fund grows because the companies inside it earn real revenue, hire real people, and build real products year after year. A savings account rate is just whatever a bank decides to offer you today, shaped entirely by whatever the Fed decided at its last meeting. There is no asset underneath it. Nothing is actually growing. It is a number printed on a web page, and that number can change tomorrow morning with no warning and no apology. Between 2015 and 2022, millions of Americans held big cash balances earning essentially nothing because that was the only option available. The high yield era felt like it fixed that for good. It did not. It fixed it temporarily. The window narrowed, and the people who had built their entire liquidity plan around 5% had to scramble, move money, and accept that the golden window had closed. There is also a quieter cost I only recognized in hindsight. When you have $50,000 you can reach in a single day, something shifts in the way you make decisions. The cushion gets so thick, it becomes a reason to wait. You feel financially accomplished because the number is big and visible. You push off opening the brokerage account for one more quarter. You contribute less urgently to retirement because the emergency fund feels like it already covers everything. That sense of security is not entirely accurate, and it carries a real cost in lost momentum. Because security and trajectory are not the same thing. One tells you where you stand today. The other decides where you actually end up. And this is not just my opinion. Pew Research and the Urban Institute have both documented that the wealth gap between American households is not mainly driven by income differences. It is driven by what people actually do with their savings over time. Two families earning nearly identical incomes across a 20-year period can end up in completely different financial positions based almost entirely on how much of their savings they put to work in appreciating assets versus how much they left sitting in low-return accounts, waiting for a certainty that never quite arrives. Because the savings account is not where wealth is built. It is where wealth waits. And waiting always has a price. So, what did a year and a half with $50,000 in a high-yield savings account actually teach me? A few things, very clearly. First, the tax bite is bigger than the ads imply, so calculate your real after-tax return before you decide how large a balance to keep. For a typical middle-income earner, the real net number lands closer to 3% than to 5%. Still positive, still better than nothing, but a very different number than the one on the homepage. Second, the emergency fund rule has a specific size for a reason. 3 to 6 months of real living expenses is the target, not a vague suggestion. Once you have that covered, extra cash above that threshold usually has a longer time horizon, and it probably belongs somewhere with a higher long-term return. Third, the rate is not a guarantee, so do not anchor your entire plan to it. The 5% that felt like the new normal in 2023 was a product of one specific Fed policy window, and that window has partly closed. The market 10% historical average, by contrast, has outlasted every single interest rate cycle in American history. And the last lesson is the hardest one to hold on to. The feeling of financial safety and the reality of financial progress are two separate things. They often feel identical. They rarely are. A big number in a savings account produces comfort, and comfort is worth something, but it is not worth $284,000. So the real question worth asking about your money is not whether it is safe. It is whether it is working as hard as your future is going to need it to. Before you go, the links are below. The ebooks, the financial calculators, all of it lives over at Jet Set Wealth Style. Think of it as the homework your bank was quietly hoping you would never sit down and actually do. I am Biscuits. Now, go put your money to work.